Out here, the land doesn't care about your promises. It remembers blood, sweat, and secrets, and it keeps them buried deep. For Josephine Monroe, leaving the soot-stained skies of Philadelphia behind the promise was a new life, a new name, and the love of a good man, Clayton Coulter. His letters painted a picture of a paradise carved from the wilderness, a ranch called Blackwood Creek. But what she found wasn't paradise. It was a purgatory of dust desire, and a lie so profound it would poison the very ground she walked on. She came for one man, but his brothers were waiting. The letter, now soft and frayed, as old linen, was Josephine Monroe's only true possession. Its ink, a faded sepia, held more value than the few dollars tucked into the lining of her worn traveling dress. She traced the elegant looping script of his name for the 100th time, Clayton Coulter, my dearest Josephine. He had written 6 months prior. The spring thaw has finally broken the grip of winter on the valley. The creek is running high and the cottonwoods are budding. It's a time of renewal, and my heart feels it too, knowing you will soon be here. I count the days not by the sun but by the anticipation of seeing your face, a face I know only from that small, treasured photograph. Josephine pressed a hand to her chest, the ache of hope so sharp it was almost painful. In the stifling, crowded confines of the stagecoach, Clayton's words were a cool breeze. For a woman of 24, an orphan raised by the stern charity of a church mission in Philadelphia, the prospect of being a mail-order bride was not a romantic fantasy. It was an escape. It was the only door out of a life of darning other people's socks and serving soup to other people's children, a life of perpetual grayness. Clayton's letters had been the first color she'd known. He wrote of the ranch Blackwood Creek, nestled in a valley in the Montana Territory. He described the snow-capped peaks of the Beartooth Mountains that stood like silent sentinels to the west. He spoke of the scent of pine after a rainstorm, the thunder of a buffalo herd in the distance, and the fierce, quiet pride of building something from nothing. He was a poet with calloused hands. He'd been honest about his circumstances. He and his 2 brothers, Sterling and Caleb, had inherited the ranch after their parents succumbed to influenza a few years back. He was the middle brother, the one with the vision, the one who handled the books and the correspondence. Sterling, the eldest, was the brawn, a man of the earth, as Clayton put it. Caleb, the youngest, was the fire wild and untamed, a master horseman who was more comfortable in the saddle than on his own 2 feet. We are 3 parts of a whole, Clayton had written. Sterling is the foundation, Caleb is the storm, and I suppose, am the walls that try to hold it all together. But a house is not a home without a heart, and that my dear Josephine is what I hope you will be. The journey had been brutal. The train from Philadelphia to Omaha was a clattering, smoke-filled ordeal. The riverboat to Fort Benton was a gamble against sandbars and engine failures. But the final leg, the overland stagecoach, was a special kind of hell. The dust was a living entity, coating her tongue, her lungs, her very soul. The sun was a merciless hammer, and the nights were filled with the unnerving howls of coyotes that sounded like the ghosts of lonely men. But she endured it all by clinging to the image of Clayton Coulter. He'd sent a photograph, a formal tintype. A handsome man with kind, steady eyes, a strong jawline, and a thick mustache that couldn't quite hide a gentle smile. He looked dependable. He looked like a man who could build the home he promised. The stagecoach driver, a grizzled man named Roscoe, with a tobacco-stained beard, finally called out, "Next stop is the turn-off for the Coulter place. Another hour, miss." A nervous flutter erupted in Josephine's stomach. Soon. After all these months, all these miles, it was finally real. She smoothed her dress for the 1,000th time, trying to pat the dust from its dark wool fibers. She checked her reflection in a small hand mirror, pinching her cheeks to bring some color to a face pale with fatigue. The woman staring back at her looked tired, frightened, but her eyes, a deep, determined blue, held a flicker of the same fire Clayton had described in his youngest brother. She was not a fragile doll. Life had already seen to that. As the coach rumbled on, the landscape began to change. The endless flat prairie gave way to rolling foothills dotted with juniper and sage. A flash of silver in the distance became a winding creek, its banks lined with the cottonwoods Clayton had described. Her heart beat a frantic rhythm against her ribs. This was it. This was his land. The coach slowed and pulled to a halt at a crudely marked turnoff. A weathered wooden sign read simply, "Coulter." "This is as far as I go," Roscoe grunted, wrestling her small trunk from the roof. "They said one of them would be here to meet you." Josephine stepped down her legs, unsteady on solid ground for the first time in days. She scanned the horizon. A dirt track snaked its way toward a cluster of buildings nestled in a valley about a mile away. But there was no one there. No horse, no wagon. Just the whisper of the wind through the tall grass and the vast, indifferent blue of the Montana sky. A knot of unease tightened in her stomach. Clayton was meticulous. His letters were planned precise. He wouldn't forget. He couldn't. "Probably got held up," Roscoe said, seeming to read her mind. "A calf could have gotten loose. A fence could be down. Ranch life ain't beholden to a stagecoach schedule." He tipped his hat. "Good luck to you, miss." And with a crack of the whip and a jangle of harnesses, the stagecoach lumbered away, leaving Josephine standing alone on the edge of her new life, a solitary figure in a sea of grass, with her trunk, her hopes, and a single terrifying question. Where was he? She waited for an hour, the sun beating down on her head, before making a decision. She would not be a damsel stranded at the side of the road. She was Josephine Monroe, and she had come too far to be defeated by an empty welcome. Hoisting the handle of her heavy trunk in one hand and her valise in the other, she squared her shoulders and began the long, dusty walk toward Blackwood Creek Ranch. Every step was an act of faith, a prayer that the man who had written such beautiful words was waiting for her just beyond the next rise. The walk was longer and harder than she'd imagined. The hem of her dress grew heavy with dust and burrs. Her fine city shoes, never meant for such terrain, pinched her feet. Sweat trickled down her temples, carving clean paths through the grime on her face. But with every step the ranch came into clearer view, and with it a burgeoning sense of awe. It was a proper place. A large, sturdy-looking ranch house, built of thick timber logs, stood at the center, flanked by a massive barn, several corrals, and a handful of smaller outbuildings. Smoke curled lazily from a stone chimney, a welcome sign of life. This was no dirt-scrabble homesteader's claim. This was a legacy. This was the foundation Clayton had written about. As she drew closer, a figure emerged from the barn. He was tall and broad-shouldered, moving with a deliberate, unhurried gait. He wore dusty denim trousers and a sweat-stained chambray shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal powerfully muscled forearms. He stopped when he saw her shielding his eyes with a hand. This had to be Sterling the Foundation. He strode toward her, his expression unreadable. He wasn't smiling. "You must be Miss Monroe," he said when he was a few feet away. His voice was a low rumble, like rocks shifting deep in the earth. It held none of the poetic warmth of Clayton's letters. "I am," Josephine said, trying to catch her breath. "Josephine. And you must be Sterling." He gave a curt nod, his eyes a pale, washed-out blue, assessing her from head to toe. They lingered for a moment on her ruined shoes and dusty face. "You walked from the turn-off." There was no one to meet me. A hint of accusation crept into her tone. "We weren't expecting the stage today," he said, his gaze flicking away toward the mountains. He reached for her trunk. "Here, let me take that." His hand brushed hers, and she was struck by the rough, calloused texture of his skin. This was a man who spoke with his labor, not his words. He led her toward the house. "Clayton's not here." The words hit her like a physical blow. Not here, but he knew I was coming. His last letter. "He was called away," Sterling said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "Urgent business. A cattle buy over in the Gallatin Valley. It came up sudden." Josephine's mind raced. It didn't make sense. Clayton, the man of meticulous plans, would leave the day his bride was to arrive. "He didn't leave a note for me." "He didn't have time," Sterling replied, his jaw tight. It was that sudden. He felt terrible about it. He pushed open the heavy wooden door to the ranch house. "He asked us to make you comfortable until he returns." The inside of the house was cool and dark after the glare of the sun. It was a man's home, functional, clean, but lacking any softness. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, surrounded by sturdy hand-carved furniture. The air smelled of wood smoke, leather, and coffee. "Where should I put my things?" Josephine asked, her voice small. The disappointment was a bitter pill in her throat. Before Sterling could answer, another man appeared from a hallway. He was leaner than Sterling, with a restless energy that seemed to fill the room. His hair was the color of dark honey, and it fell boyishly across his forehead. He had a charming, lopsided grin, and eyes the color of warm whiskey that lit up when he saw her. This was Caleb. The storm. "Well, look what the stagecoach dragged in," he said, his voice a smooth, melodic drawl. He wiped his hands on his trousers and strode forward, his smile widening. "You must be the beautiful Josephine. Clayton didn't do you justice." He took her hand, and instead of shaking it, brought it to his lips. The gesture was so unexpected, so forward, that Josephine felt a blush creep up her neck. "Caleb." Sterling's voice was a low warning. Caleb ignored him, his eyes never leaving Josephine's. "I'm Caleb, the handsome one." He winked. "Clayton is the smart one, Sterling is the strong one, and I'm the one who makes life interesting." Josephine couldn't help but smile despite her disappointment. Caleb's charm was infectious, a stark contrast to Sterling's stoic reserve. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Caleb." "The pleasure is all mine," he said. "Don't you mind Sterling. He was born with a thundercloud over his head. We're honored to have you, Josephine. Truly." "Caleb, show her to the spare room," Sterling instructed, hoisting her trunk as if it weighed nothing. "The one next to Clayton's. Get her some water." "Right away," Caleb said, offering Josephine his arm. "Come on. Let me show you your new home. For now, at least." The room was simple, but clean, with a bed covered in a thick quilt, a small washstand, and a window that looked out onto the vast rolling plains. It was also, as Sterling had pointedly mentioned, directly next to another closed door, Clayton's room. A room she couldn't enter. A man she couldn't see. As Caleb set down her valise, Josephine's resolve crumbled. She sank onto the edge of the bed, the exhaustion and disappointment of the day washing over her. "When do you expect him back?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Caleb's charming expression softened. He knelt in front of her, his whiskey-colored eyes full of a surprising sincerity. "Soon," he said gently. "The Gallatin Valley isn't that far. A week, maybe 2 at the most. He was just as torn up about leaving as you are, about him being gone, I promise you that." He reached out and tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear. His touch was light, but it sent a strange shiver through her. Don't you worry, Josephine. We'll take good care of you. My brother has excellent taste." That night, Josephine lay awake in the strange bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch, the lowing of cattle, the creak of the floorboards, as the house settled the distant howl of a lone wolf. She felt a profound sense of dislocation. She was in the house, promised to her, surrounded by the life promised to her, but the man at the center of it all was a ghost. She clutched the faded letters to her chest. The words were still beautiful, but they felt hollow, now echoes in an empty house. She was in the home of the Coulter brothers, but she was utterly terrifyingly alone. And as she drifted into an uneasy sleep, she couldn't shake the feeling that the excuse for Clayton's absence was as thin and brittle as a dried autumn leaf. The days that followed bled into one another, each marked by the same routine, a sunrise that painted the sky in impossible shades of orange and pink, the hard work of the ranch, and a sunset that left Josephine feeling smaller and more isolated than the day before. Clayton did not return. No letter arrived. No messenger came riding over the hill. When she asked, Sterling would give her a tight-lipped "soon," while Caleb would offer a charmingly evasive, "A deal like this takes time, Josie. You have to be patient." He started calling her Josie. The nickname spoken in his smooth drawl felt both intimate and presumptuous. But in the vast emptiness of her days, Caleb became her shadow, her guide, her distraction, while Sterling was a creature of dawn and dusk, tirelessly mending fences, breaking horses, and overseeing the two ranch hands, a quiet Mexican man named Miguel, and a young boy named Sam Caleb seemed to operate on his own schedule. He was the one who showed her the ranch, not the fences and the ledges, but its soul. He took her riding on a gentle mare named Delilah, leading her to hidden groves of aspen whose leaves trembled like golden coins in the breeze. He showed her the creek where the trout gathered in the deep, cool pools. He taught her the names of the wildflowers that grew in defiant splashes of color against the brown earth Indian paintbrush lupin bitterroot. "Clayton would have told you the Latin names for all of these," Caleb said one afternoon, as they sat by the creek, skipping stones across the water. "He'd have told you about their medicinal properties. He reads books." He shot her a sideways glance, his grin flashing. "I just think they're pretty." With Caleb, life was not about waiting. It was about living. He was impulsive and full of a restless energy that chafed against the slow, deliberate pace of the ranch. He coaxed her into a horse race back to the barn, and his laughter echoed across the valley when she beat him by a nose. He dared her to wade barefoot in the icy creek, then splashed her until she was shrieking with laughter and surprise. He was chipping away at the formal, frightened woman who had arrived weeks earlier, revealing someone she barely recognized herself. Someone who could laugh until her sides ached, someone whose hair could come undone in the wind without a care. Sterling watched them from a distance, his disapproval a palpable force. Josephine would often feel his pale blue eyes on her as she and Caleb returned from a ride, their faces flushed, their clothes dusty. He never said a word, but his silence was a judgment. She was Clayton's intended, and this was not proper. One evening, after a particularly potent dose of Caleb's charm, Josephine found herself cornered by Sterling in the kitchen. "You should be careful, Josephine," he said, his voice low. He was cleaning a rifle, his large hands methodical and precise. "Careful of what?" she asked, her chin held high. "Caleb, he's a brush fire, exciting to watch, but he burns through things fast, people included." "He's been nothing but kind to me," she retorted. "He's been a friend when I desperately needed one." "Clayton is your friend," Sterling said, his eyes meeting hers in the lantern light. "Don't forget why you're here." The reminder stung. Every night she lay in her bed, the wall separating her from Clayton's room, a symbol of the chasm between the life she was promised and the one she was living. Guilt was a constant companion. Guilt that she was laughing with Caleb, that she was starting to enjoy her days, that she sometimes went hours without thinking of the man whose photograph sat on her nightstand. The breaking point came during a sudden, violent thunderstorm. The sky, which had been clear an hour before, turned a bruised purple. Wind howled through the valley, and rain lashed against the windows of the ranch house. The lights flickered and died, plunging them into darkness. Josephine, who had always been terrified of storms, let out a small cry. Suddenly, a hand found hers in the dark. "It's just the sky letting off some steam, Josie." Caleb's voice was a low murmur beside her. "Nothing to be afraid of." He led her to the window. A brilliant fork of lightning illuminated the landscape, freezing the thrashing trees and the rain-slicked corral in a stark, beautiful tableau. In that brief flash, she saw his face, his expression uncharacteristically serious. "My mother used to say, a storm was the earth's way of washing itself clean," he said softly, "getting rid of all the dust and grime." The thunder that followed was a deafening crack that shook the very foundations of the house. Josephine flinched, pressing closer to him without thinking. His arm went around her, pulling her against his side. He smelled of rain leather and something uniquely his own, something wild and warm. "See," he whispered, his breath warm against her ear. "You're safe here." They stood there for a long time, watching the storm rage outside, wrapped in the dark intimacy of the house. The fear inside her slowly receded, replaced by a different kind of storm, a tempest of confusion and forbidden desire. When he tilted her chin up, his intentions were clear in the faint light. His lips were soft at first, questioning. When she didn't pull away, the kiss deepened, becoming as fierce and desperate as the storm outside. It was a kiss that tasted of longing, of loneliness, of weeks of unspoken tension. It was wrong, a betrayal of the man who had brought her here, but in that moment it felt like the only real thing in a world of latches and waiting. When they finally broke apart, breathless, the only sound was the drumming of the rain and the frantic beating of her own heart. "Josie." He breathed her name like a prayer. She had come to Montana for the steady, dependable love of Clayton Coulter. But in his absence, she had been swept up by the storm, and she was terrified she was about to be broken by it. The morning after the storm, the world felt scrubbed clean, but Josephine's soul was muddied with guilt. The kiss with Caleb hung in the air between them, a secret that crackled with unspoken energy. He was more attentive than ever, his whiskey-colored eyes constantly seeking hers, his touch lingering on her arm or the small of her back. But for Josephine, the thrill of the forbidden moment had curdled into a deep unease. This wasn't her. She was not a woman of impulsive, stolen kisses in the dark. She was a woman who craved stability, honesty, a foundation. And the more Caleb's charm felt like a whirlwind, the more she found herself watching the man who was its complete opposite Sterling. Sterling was the quiet rhythm of the ranch. He was the first one up his boots, echoing on the porch boards before dawn. He was the last one to bed, after checking the stock one final time. He spoke little, but his actions were a language all their own. He noticed when the wood box by the stove was low and filled it without being asked. He saw her struggling to work the stubborn water pump, and the next day it moved with a new, smooth ease. He left a bucket of late-blooming, resilient wildflowers on the porch for her one morning, a silent offering that spoke more than all of Caleb's pretty words. Her affair with Caleb, if it could even be called that, was a thing of fleeting, breathless moments. A quick touch behind the barn, a shared glance across the dinner table. It was exhilarating, but hollow. It had no future. Caleb was the present, a thrilling, dangerous distraction. But as the weeks stretched into a month, and then nearly 2, Josephine began to crave a future. And the future, she started to realize, looked a lot more like Sterling. The change was gradual. She began to seek him out, bringing him a cup of coffee in the cold morning air as he saddled his horse. At first, their conversations were stilted practical. He'd talk about the weather, the price of beef, a sick calf. But she persisted, asking him about the ranch, about his parents, about the valley. She learned that his quietness was not a lack of feeling, but a vessel for containing too much of it. She learned that his father had taught him how to read the land, and his mother had taught him how to be gentle with the animals. He spoke of them in the present tense, as if they were just in the next room. "This was my mother's," he said one afternoon, finding her admiring a small, neglected patch of herbs near the house. Rosemary, thyme, lavender. She said a home needed to smell like more than just men and leather. He knelt his large, calloused fingers, gently pulling a weed from the soil. "I haven't been good about keeping it up." "I could help," Josephine offered softly. He looked up at her, and for the first time she saw something in his pale blue eyes beyond duty and disapproval. It was a deep, aching loneliness, a mirror of her own. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. She'd have liked that. From then on, the herb garden became their space. They worked in comfortable silence, their hands in the same soil, coaxing life back into the dormant plants. It was there that she found the courage to ask the question that had been tormenting her. "Sterling, are you sure there's nothing wrong?" He stopped his work, his back to her. "What do you mean, with Clayton?" she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It's been so long. No letters, no word at all. It's not like him. It's not like the man who wrote to me." Sterling's shoulders tensed. He remained silent for a long moment before slowly rising and turning to face her. His expression was grim. "The Gallatin is a long way off. A man can get delayed." "But not for this long," she insisted, stepping closer to him. "Not without sending word. I feel like you're not telling me something. Both of you." He looked at her, and his gaze was so intense it felt like he was seeing straight through her skin and into the mess of her heart. He saw her guilt over Caleb, her fear for Clayton, her desperation for a place to belong. "Life out here is hard, Josephine," he said, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't name. "Sometimes things don't go according to plan. Sometimes you have to make do with what you've got." His words were an evasion, yet they felt like a confession. Her eyes filled with tears of frustration and fear. "I can't live like this, in this limbo, waiting for a ghost." A single tear escaped and traced a path through the dirt on her cheek. Before she even realized what was happening, Sterling's hand came up his thumb, gently wiping the tear away. His touch was nothing like Caleb's. It wasn't light or playful. It was heavy, grounding a silent promise of protection. It was the touch of a man who could hold up the world. He held her gaze for a heartbeat longer, his hand still cupping her cheek. The air between them was thick with all the things they weren't saying. She saw a flicker of desire in his eyes, but it was buried deep beneath layers of duty grief and a fierce, protective loyalty. He wanted to tell her. She could feel it. But he wouldn't. He couldn't. He dropped his hand and took a step back the wall between them, firmly back in place. "He'll be back soon," he said, the lie sounding weaker than ever. You just have to be patient." He turned and walked away, his broad back a symbol of the unbreachable fortress that was the Coulter brothers' secret. Josephine stood alone by the herb garden, the scent of lavender and rosemary filling the air. She had come seeking a home, with one man fallen into the arms of another, and now found herself inexplicably drawn to the third. She was entangled with all of them, caught in a web of passion duty and deceit, and she knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that the web was woven around a terrible gaping hole at its center, a hole where Clayton Coulter was supposed to be. The first frost of autumn laid a glittering blanket over the valley, a stark reminder of how much time had passed. Summer had bled away, and with it, Josephine's last vestiges of naive hope. Clayton was not coming back. She knew it in her bones, a cold, hard certainty that had taken root in the soil of the brothers' evasions. The question was no longer if something had happened to him, but what and why they were so determined to hide it. Her life at Blackwood Creek had settled into a fragile, unsustainable triangle. Caleb continued his campaign of charm, stealing kisses that now felt more like acts of desperation than passion. Sterling continued his silent watch, his acts of quiet care a constant, painful reminder of the stability she craved but couldn't have. She was a ghost in her own life, haunting the hallways of a house that was meant to be her home, sleeping next to the room of a man who was becoming more myth than memory. Suspicion became her constant companion. It sharpened her senses, made her an observer in the drama of her own life. She started to notice things. She noticed the way Sterling and Caleb never spoke Clayton's name unless she brought it up first, and when they did, their voices became stilted and unnatural. She noticed the way Miguel, the older ranch hand, would cross himself whenever he passed a certain grove of cottonwood trees down by the creek. His dark eyes filled with a sorrow he tried to hide from her. She noticed the locked door at the end of the main hall, the room that had been their father's study. Once she'd asked Caleb what was inside. "Just old ranch records and dust," he'd said with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Sterling keeps the key. He's the keeper of the crypt." The casual cruelty of his words sent a shiver down her spine. The catalyst came in the form of a small, leather-bound ledger. She found it tucked away on a high shelf in the pantry while searching for canning jars. It was Clayton's. His elegant script filled the pages detailing ranch expenses, cattle counts, and breeding records. It was a testament to the meticulous man from the letters. She took it to her room, her heart pounding. She lit a lamp and began to read, her fingers tracing his handwriting. She scanned through entries from the previous year, then into the spring. She saw notes about purchasing new seed, about the price of lumber for a new section of fencing, and then an entry that made her blood run cold. April 14th. Met with Josephine Monroe's letter. A woman of spirit and substance, I think. Sent reply and my photograph. The future feels possible. She read on her breath, catching in her throat. He had documented their entire correspondence, his hopes growing with each letter she sent. The final entry was dated a week before her arrival. May 27th. Final preparations for Miss Monroe's arrival. Stage is due on the 5th of June. Sterling is wary, says it's a fool's risk to pin hopes on a photograph. Caleb is amused, calls me a romantic. Perhaps I am. But after so long, this house needs a heart. I pray she is the one. There was nothing after that. The next page was blank. The meticulous record-keeper had simply stopped. But he hadn't left for the Gallatin Valley. If he had, there would have been a note, a record of funds taken for the trip. He was a man who documented everything. Everything except his own disappearance. The next day, armed with a terrible new resolve, she approached Miguel while he was mending a bridle near the barn. Sterling and Caleb were out on the range, checking on a distant herd. It was her only chance. "Miguel," she began, her voice steady, despite the tremor in her hands. "You were fond of Clayton, weren't you?" The old man's weathered face softened, his eyes clouding over. "Sí, señorita. He was a good man. Un hombre bueno, smart, kind. You miss him?" She stated, not as a question. He nodded, his eyes dropping to the leather in his hands. "Every day." He used the past tense. "Miguel, look at me," she pleaded. "Where is he?" The old man flinched, looking around nervously, as if the brothers might materialize from the very air. "It is not my place, señorita. They made me promise. A promise to lie to me." She pressed her voice, rising. "To let me live here, waiting and wondering, going half mad with it. Is that what a good man would want?" Miguel's composure broke. His dark eyes filled with tears. No, he would not have wanted this. He was so happy you were coming, so full of plans. He took a deep, shuddering breath. "They did it for the ranch, señorita. They said it was the only way." Did what, Miguel? What was the only way? He wouldn't say more, just shook his head and retreated into a stubborn silence. But he had given her the final piece she needed. He had spoken of Clayton in the past tense. He had confirmed the lie. Her mind raced back to his other tell, the way he crossed himself when he passed the cottonwood grove by the creek, the same grove Caleb had taken her to on one of their first rides. She didn't wait. She didn't think. She ran. She ran from the barn, past the house, her skirts flying behind her, her heart a wild drum against her ribs. She followed the path to the creek, her eyes scanning the stand of trees. It was tucked away, almost hidden from view, by a thicket of wild roses, their thorns now bare and brittle in the autumn air. It was a simple mound of earth, marked by a crude wooden cross. The wood was still relatively new, not yet fully weathered by the sun and snow. There were no words carved into it, just a date. May 29th. 2 days after his final hopeful entry in the ledger, a week before she was scheduled to arrive. Josephine fell to her knees, a strangled sob escaping her lips. The world tilted on its axis, the beautiful valley twisting into a grotesque parody of the paradise she had been promised. The breeze whispering through the cottonwood leaves sounded like a mournful dirge. He was dead. He had been dead the entire time. Every moment at the ranch, every smile from Caleb, every quiet gesture from Sterling, every night she had lain in that bed, waiting, had been built upon this single, monumental, heart-breaking lie. They hadn't been protecting her. They had been using her. She stayed there for what felt like hours, the cold of the earth seeping into her bones. The grief was sharp and strange grief for a man she had never met, but whose hopes had become her own. But beneath the grief, a new feeling began to smoulder, hot and powerful. Rage. A cold, clear, all-consuming rage. She rose to her feet, her movements stiff. She wiped the tears from her face with the back of her hand, leaving a muddy streak. Her blue eyes, once filled with hope and then confusion, were now as hard and cold as river stones in winter. She turned her back on the unmarked grave and began the walk back to the house. She was no longer waiting for answers. She was going to demand them. The storm that Caleb had so admired was nothing compared to the one that was about to break over the house of Coulter. She found them in the barn, as dusk settled, the last rays of sunlight slanting through the dusty air in golden shafts. They were working together, forking hay into the loft, their movements synchronized by years of shared labor. The scene was so domestic, so normal it was obscene. They stopped when she appeared in the wide doorway, her small frame silhouetted against the fading light. They knew instantly. Something in her posture, in the chilling stillness of her face, told them the charade was over. Caleb was the first to speak, his charming smile faltering. "Josie, what is it? You look like you've seen a ghost." "I have," she said, her voice devoid of all its former warmth. It was a shard of ice. "I've just come from visiting my fiancé." The color drained from Caleb's face. Sterling, who was standing on the ladder to the loft, slowly descended his eyes, never leaving hers. His expression was one of grim resignation, of a man finally facing a sentence he'd known was coming. "The cottonwood grove is lovely this time of year," Josephine continued, her voice trembling with barely suppressed fury. She took a step into the barn, the scent of hay and horses filling her lungs. "It's a peaceful spot. Did you think it was peaceful when you put him in the ground? Josephine, let us explain." Sterling said, his voice a low rumble. "Explain." She let out a laugh, a harsh, ugly sound that echoed in the cavernous space. "Explain what? That you let me travel 2,000 miles to marry your dead brother. That you let me live in his house, sleep in the room next to his, wait for him every single day, while knowing he was rotting in the ground a few hundred yards away. What part of that requires an explanation?" She turned her venom on Caleb, who looked utterly stricken. "And you with your pretty words and your easy smiles. Was I just a game to you, a pleasant distraction? Did you get a thrill out of seducing your brother's grieving bride-to-be?" "No, Josie, it wasn't like that," Caleb pleaded, taking a step toward her. "Don't you call me that!" she shrieked, recoiling as if he were a snake. "Don't you ever use that name again. We did it for you." Caleb insisted, his voice cracking. "We didn't know what else to do. We couldn't just send you back. You could have told me the truth." She cried, tears of rage finally streaming down her face. "You could have treated me like a human being, not a piece of property that came with the ranch." It was then that Sterling stepped forward, his face a mask of stone. But behind the mask, his pale eyes were swimming with a torment that rivaled her own. "It was for the ranch," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of his confession. "It was for him." He explained it, all the words tumbling out in a raw, disjointed narrative. A freak accident. A skittish colt. Clayton was breaking a bad fall, his head striking a rock. He was gone before they could even get him back to the house. It happened on May 29th, 2 days after he'd written his last, hopeful entry in his ledger. They had been paralyzed by grief and panic. Clayton was the heart of the operation, but he was also the one with the debt. He had taken out a substantial loan from a banker in Miles City, a man named Silas Blackwood, to purchase a neighboring parcel of land, securing the ranch's water rights. The loan was in his name, and the note was coming due. "The will," Sterling said, his voice hoarse. "Our father's will. The ranch is to be held in common, but if one of us dies without issue, his share is absorbed by the surviving brothers. Clayton, he changed it. A month before you were due to arrive, he drew up a new document. He left his third of the ranch to his wife, to you." Josephine stared at him, uncomprehending. "Don't you see?" Caleb cut in, his voice desperate. "If you didn't arrive, if you weren't his wife, his share would be ours, but Silas Blackwood would have called in the loan. He knew Clayton was the one with the head for figures. With him gone, he'd have seen us as weak and easy target to foreclose on. But if Clayton had a wife, a widow, it would complicate things. It would buy us time. We needed you here. We needed you to be Mrs. Clayton Coulter, at least on paper." The cold, cynical logic of it was breathtaking. She wasn't a woman to them. She was a legal loophole, a shield. "So what was the plan?" she asked, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Fatten me up and have one of you marry me to keep the share in the family. Which one of you was going to do the honors?" Her gaze flickered between them from Caleb's desperate charm to Sterling's stoic misery. A muscle worked in Sterling's jaw. The silence stretched thick with accusation. It was he who finally broke it, but what he said shattered the last piece of her heart. He took a step toward her, his face contorted with a strange mixture of anger, guilt, and a raw, possessive pain. She didn't understand. "What's your game, Josephine?" He snarled, his voice low and dangerous. The sudden shift from confession to accusation stunned her into silence. "You came here for Clayton, but he was gone, so you fluttered your lashes at Caleb, let him chase you all over this valley. You let him kiss you." Caleb flinched as if he'd been struck. "And then?" Sterling continued, his pale eyes boring into her. "When his charms wore thin, you came to me. With your sad eyes and your talk of herb gardens, you leaned on me. You made me feel responsible." He advanced on her, his large frame seeming to suck all the air from the barn. He was close enough now that she could see the flecks of grey in his eyes, the deep lines of exhaustion etched around them. "You've had one of us to excite you, and one of us to protect you. You've been living in our house, eating our food, sleeping under our roof." His voice dropped to a venomous whisper, spitting the words that would haunt her forever. "You think you're a victim in all this. Don't you see? In a way, you're sleeping with all of us." The accusation was so monstrous, so fundamentally unfair that it stole her breath. He had twisted their lies, their manipulation, their sins, and laid them at her feet. He had made her the villain in a story they had written. In that moment, she didn't see a grieving brother or a stoic protector. She saw a cruel, desperate man lashing out, and she hated him with every fiber of her being. "Get away from me," she whispered, her voice shaking with a rage so profound it left no room for tears. "Both of you." She turned and fled the barn, running blindly back toward the house. But it wasn't a home. It was a prison built of lies, and its wardens were 3 brothers, 1 dead, and 2 who had just destroyed what was left of her soul. The days following the confrontation were a cold war fought within the confines of the ranch. The house, once filled with unspoken tension, was now suffocated by a thick, ringing silence. Josephine became a ghost in its halls, emerging from her room only when necessary, her face a pale mask of fury and grief. She was a prisoner, trapped by the vast, indifferent landscape and her own destitution. To leave would require money she did not have, and a destination that did not exist. She was bound to the place that had broken her. The brothers were no better. The lie that had united them had shattered, leaving a chasm of resentment in its place. They moved like thunderclouds on opposite ends of the property, their anger a palpable force. At night, Josephine would lie awake and hear the muffled sounds of their arguments drifting from the main room, Caleb's desperate pleading tones, and Sterling's harsh, guttural accusations. They had not only betrayed her, they had poisoned the memory of the brother they claimed to be protecting, and in doing so, had broken the foundational bond between them. The fragile, hateful peace was shattered by a cloud of dust on the horizon. A buggy and a single rider were approaching, with a purpose that spoke not of neighborly visits, but of conquest. Sterling, standing on the porch, saw them first. His body went rigid. "Caleb!" He bellowed, his voice a sharp crack of command. "Get to the house." The rider was a man in his 50s, dressed in a fine city suit that looked absurdly out of place. He had a neatly trimmed silver beard and the cold, calculating eyes of a vulture. This was Silas Blackwood. He dismounted with an oily smile, leaving his lawyer in the buggy. "Sterling Caleb." Blackwood called out, his voice dripping with false pleasantry. "I've come to discuss a matter of some urgency." "There's nothing to discuss, Blackwood," Sterling said, positioning himself on the top step, a human barrier before the home. "Oh, I think there is." Blackwood purred his eyes, scanning the ranch with a proprietary air. "I hold the note on this land, a note which is now in default. I am here to execute my claim." "The payment isn't due for another 2 weeks," Caleb snapped, joining his brother on the porch. "A minor detail," Blackwood said with a dismissive wave. "The loan agreement, which your dear brother Clayton was perhaps too eager to sign, contains a viability clause. It states that upon the signatory's death, the lender may reassess the operation's stability. If it is found wanting, the note can be called in immediately. And from what I hear—" He paused, savoring the moment. "Things here are very much wanting." The trap carefully laid weeks ago was now sprung. Blackwood had been waiting, watching them devour each other from the inside out. "This ranch is viable," Sterling growled, his hand dropping to rest near the Colt at his hip. "Is it—" Blackwood's eyes glinted with triumph. "Because I also hear Clayton made some romantic last-minute changes to his will. That his share now belongs to a Miss Josephine Monroe." He turned his cold gaze directly to the window, where Josephine stood, watching a chill of dread icing her veins. He knew everything. A woman who, having never married the man, has no legal standing as his wife. His share is in legal limbo, making my claim clean, simple, and immediate. Inside the house, the floor seemed to drop out from under Josephine. He was right. She wasn't a widow. She was nothing. The shield the brothers had tried to use her as had been useless from the very beginning. Their entire cruel, pointless deception had been for nothing. The confrontation outside escalated. Caleb, with a raw cry of fury, launched himself from the porch and tackled Blackwood, sending them both tumbling into the dust. The moment exploded into chaos. Blackwood's hired man drew his pistol. Sterling drew his, shouting Caleb's name. From her window, Josephine watched the pathetic, grubby fight. This was the culmination of all the lies, the grief, the greed. And in that instant, something inside her solidified. The rage and hurt were still there, but a new, powerful emotion surged through them, a fierce, defiant sense of ownership. She had suffered for this place. Her tears had watered its soil. Silas Blackwood would not take it. She moved with a purpose she hadn't felt in months. She ran from her room to the locked study at the end of the hall, the key left on a nail by the main door, feeling cool and solid in her trembling hand. The room was Clayton's sanctuary, smelling of old paper and quiet ambition. She went straight to the desk, pulling open drawers until she found it, a heavy double-barreled shotgun. Her hands shook as she broke it open and slotted 2 shells into the chambers. The loud, mechanical click-clack was the sound of her resolve hardening into steel. She walked back out onto the porch, the gun held steady in her hands. The fight had become a tense standoff. Sterling and Blackwood's man with guns drawn, Caleb, holding a bloodied Blackwood on the ground. "That's enough," Josephine said. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the standoff with absolute authority. All 4 men stared at her. They saw not a frightened mail-order bride, but a woman holding a shotgun with an expression that promised she knew how to use it. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice unnervingly calm, "you are right. I am not Clayton Coulter's widow, but his will names me as the inheritor of his 1/3 share of this property. That makes me a partner in this enterprise. And as a partner, I am telling you to get off our land." She punctuated the statement by cocking both hammers of the shotgun. The sharp double click was the only legal argument that mattered now. Blackwood, his face bleeding, stared at her, his smirk gone, replaced by stunned disbelief. He scrambled to his feet. "This isn't over," he snarled. "Today it is." Josephine replied, her eyes like blue ice. "Now go." Defeated Blackwood climbed back into his buggy and rode away, his men trailing behind him. Silence fell upon the ranch yard. Sterling and Caleb stared at Josephine, their faces a mixture of shock, awe, and profound shame. The woman they had betrayed had just fought for their home. Josephine slowly lowered the shotgun, the adrenaline leaving her weak and trembling. She looked at the two brothers, their faces bruised, their family broken, and then at the house that was her prison. "This changes nothing between us," she said, her voice cold and final. "But he is not taking this ranch. Not while I'm here." She turned and walked back into the house, leaving the Coulter brothers standing alone in the dust, forced to confront the wreckage they had made, and the formidable strength of the woman they had so terribly wronged. In the harsh light of the Montana Territory, survival was a currency paid in grit and blood, not just promises whispered in letters. Josephine Monroe arrived seeking a home, and found a grave arrived for one man, and found herself entangled with three. She was a pawn in a desperate game for legacy, and land her heart a battleground for the grief, guilt, and desire of two warring brothers. But the West has a way of forging its own kind of strength in the crucible of betrayal. She was not the woman they expected, and in the end, her fight was not for their love, or for the memory of a man she never knew. It was for the one thing she had left herself. And on the soil of Blackwood Creek, she would either carve out a future on her own terms, or be buried alongside the secrets of the men who wronged her. What would you have done in her place? The stories of the Old West are filled with tales of survival against impossible odds, and this is just one of them. If you were captivated by Josephine's journey, make sure to hit that like button, share this story with someone who loves a good Western drama, and subscribe to our channel. We uncover the forgotten stories and lost legends of the American frontier every week, and you won't want to miss the next one. Click that notification bell so you never miss a tale from the untamed West.